All right, friends, we're at 9:59, so I invite you, if you haven't yet, to get your coffee and take your seats. We'll begin shortly. Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar and interim rector here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is an absolute delight to welcome you to the forum, where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. And today we are very glad to have with us one of our own, the Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers, assisting priest here at St. Bart's. We're so used to seeing Canon Stephanie around that we forget what a big deal she is. She recently finished nearly, yes, applause. She recently finished nearly a decade as canon to presiding Bishop Michael Curry. She's also a published author many times over. I believe her books Radical Welcome and The Church Cracked Open are both still available in our bookstore. And she's here this morning to give us the first exclusive peek at the next book that she's been working diligently on for the last few months. Canon Stephanie, thank you so much for all that you do for St. Bart's, but thank you for giving us this peek today.
Well, thank you for inspiring me, St. Bart's. It's great to be here today. It's a little strange, I have to say, because I've spent the end of 2024, like the last couple of months of 2024, deep in books, researching, looking at all of the numbers about decline and really disaffiliation from churches across America, not just the Episcopal Church, all across the churches. So I spent months deep in books and charts and everything else. And then I spent January and February on the road. And so I was out there interviewing nuns and duns, by which I mean people who either were never a part of church, or maybe they were and then they stopped, but especially focusing on nuns and duns who are millennial or Gen Z. So millennials being folk who were born, basically millennial and Gen Z are folks who are right now at ages 42 to about kind of 18. So I was on the road interviewing dozens and dozens of these folks. And then I spent the last 2 or so months writing. So I've been deep in the cave again, writing this book. I've actually finished the manuscript now. I'm in the final revisions. I turn it over technically tomorrow. To the publisher. Feel free to clap for that, please. It has a cover, and it comes out in December. So I've been just in this world that's all the data, the interviews, everything else. Today is the first time I've lifted my head and sat with just folks to talk about what I've learned, and to present some of the data, some of the stories, some of the voices of the nuns and duns I've met. So thank you, St. Bart's, my home, for being a safe place for me to start to just find language that comes out of my mouth and not just out of my fingers for this book. Bless you all. I need to make a disclaimer, which is that one of my dearest friends, my brother, Dan Summers, is back here, and his daughter and my niece, Ellie, are back here. They love attention like this, believe me. But we were at Beyonce last night. Amen? Amen. Hallelujah. So for me to be doing this on about 6 hours of sleep and pretty hyped from Beyonce is, this is an experiment right now. Especially because this is decaf coffee. So, All right, time to fake the body. So, what's out there? What's happening? The first thing to know, and this is what really drove me in this whole project, was this recognition. When I was, about 4 years after I was born, 90% of Americans were Christians, and about 7% were nuns, that is, people who have no religious affiliation. About 4 years after I was born. I was baptized in 1998, and 2 years later, 80% of Americans were Christian, identified as Christian. 14% identified as non-religious or nuns. As of this year, and this year actually in 2 weeks, I'll be at 20 years ordained. 62% of Americans say they're Christians. It's not my fault, I promise you. The nuns have doubled in that same interval and are now at 28% of Americans. Now imagine following this trajectory out another 25 years. Factor in the fact that among millennial and Gen Z Americans, that is, folk who are at least the ones that we were able to do data around, who are age 44 to 18 right now, 44% of them say they are non-religious. So the generation coming up is almost half nuns. If that graph doesn't make you shiver, I don't know what will. It certainly made me shiver. It sent me out on the road. I know that a lot of my colleagues are familiar with this data. A lot of vestries may have seen some of this data before. We honestly don't sit with this information very long because we've got work to do. Amen? We got work to do. And so we kind of have heard about decline, but we sort of push it to the side. Nobody has time for a pity party. Instead, we have coping strategies. We're deep in whatever is the next congregational development program, listening to the hottest turnaround experts, hustling as hard as we can, holding on long enough for younger generations to have kids and come back to church. That's one of the strategies, right, Zach? Yes? Yep. We're holding on for that. But the truth is that even in churches as lively and energized and vital as St. Bart's, even in our midst, we know that there are some strong winds blowing, strong winds that are changing the course of life for traditional religion in America. The fundamentals have changed, the ground has shifted, and if we're just trying to do what we did before but do it better and hope that there'll be more people who love what we love and that we can just kind of stay the course, it's not going to work. Not with this. Traditional Christianity in America has officially been in systemic decline my entire life. And so while it's tempting to me too for us to kind of double down and do what we know how to do, but just do it well, we need to do some honest reckoning. We need to acknowledge that a lot of the folk here aren't coming back because many of them were never Christian to begin with. It's not like when they hit a certain age, they'll say, oh, I remember, and come back. Many of them had no back to come to, no church to come back to. And what's also true is that even if they feel the spiritual yearning and maybe even have a religious background, a lot of the folk among these nuns are discovering pathways far from church. So many different ways to satisfy that spiritual hunger beyond us. And that's why I figured that if I had this sabbatical after finishing up with working for the whole Episcopal Church, if I had this time on my hands, I could take a break. I could do some sleeping and watching Netflix. I really wish I had sometimes. But instead, I hit the road. And I went out there so that I could find out what we could learn from this group of Americans, and particularly the younger folk, the millennial and Gen Zs, who are now 44% non-religious, but deeply spiritual, deeply hungry for the sacred. I went out there because I know that we can't assume we know what's happening with them. And I also figured that maybe God is up to something in their midst, that even if they're not here inside the church, God's not waiting for them to come in. God is active everywhere. So I went out kind of curious about what's God doing in their lives. And so that's some of what I want to share with you today, is what I heard from them about the life of the Spirit, about community, and about what they would tell the churches if we were listening. Because here's the thing. The title of this book is Church Tomorrow with a question mark. But what I know is, yes, there will be church tomorrow. In fact, just say those words with me. Yes, there will be church tomorrow. Will there be church tomorrow? Yes, there will be church tomorrow. I know there will be, but I can't tell you the shape of it, the smell or the sound or the look of it. We will have to listen closely to these folk and to God, who told Ezekiel, "You shall live," when he was in that valley of dry bones. God is saying that to us right now. God will put God's Spirit in us right now. But we will have to get rerouted in relationship with God and enter into relationship with the nuns. So on the road, I interviewed 45 millennial and Gen Z nuns and duns across America. And I asked them 4 questions. Let me see if I have... Yeah, the questions will come later, but I'll tell you what they are right now. First of all, I asked them, share your spiritual journey and your path. What led you to where you are now on your journey with the sacred? How and where do you experience the sacred? That was the second question. Third question, how and where do you experience community and belonging? Since for a lot of people, that's the grit, that's the thing. When you ask folks, what do you find in church? Many will talk about God, more will talk about community and belonging. So I asked them, where are you finding it? And final question, I asked them, what would you tell the church or organized religion if we were listening? They will blow your mind. They were more than willing to answer that question. I also spoke with more than a dozen leaders who were working with young adult nuns and duns. And so I had the chance to gather up all of their stories and put them together. And especially the answers to that final question, what would you tell the church if we were listening? I gathered those up and kind of called them a prophecy. The prophecy of the nuns and duns to the churches. But before I got into all of those conversations, I really just wanted to get my feet on the ground, get some foundational understanding of what is happening in America and what happened to America so that we ended up with this religious composition where among the silent generation and the boomers, Christianity, the blue is Protestants, the orange is Catholic, other world religions are green, and then the purple and the yellow are the nuns. what happened? What happened? Well, one of the first things that happened, how we ended up with so many nones and dones in American life, is really the question. It's not just a question of decline. Bishop Matt is right when he's speaking, and so I hope this is being recorded, right? Bishop Matt was right. That yes, decline is not the whole story, but I would argue disaffiliation is the story. Disaffiliation, not just from church, but from institutions altogether. The truth is that Christian participation rose and rose in America, especially around wars. So the Civil War, you have a spike of population and a spike of church membership, church growth. After the Civil War, again, rebuilding a nation. And then it happened again after World War II. And if anything, Christian participation in America peaked in the 1950s. At that point, the post-war positive attitudes, the sense that we were nation building all across the country, the response, of course, to communism and the Cold War was also that, like, are you Christian? Are you religious? Yes, Mr. McCarthy, I am. I am absolutely religious, right? Because of all of those factors, 96% of Americans said they were Christian in 1956. 96% of Americans. By the 1960s, folks started asking some serious questions. How many of you are boomers? Just raise your hand if you're a boomer. So you know what y'all did. You know what you did. You asked those questions. You got the freedom train moving across this country, and you changed the way Americans understand race, sex, capitalism. You rejected your parents' traditions. You did. I saw you. The numbers bear it out. Many of you did. You birthed a counterculture. I know some of y'all were in there. With very liberated approaches to relationships, sexuality, drugs, music, and religion. Successive generations of Americans have thus become less and less religious. Boomers raised the, boomers are the parents of the millennials, more or less. And so boomers raised their children with freedom that they wanted to have. And then Generation X, my generation, kind of took the baton, if you will, and just like left it on the floor. We raised our children with even less religion. And so that's how you get a chart like this. You get it from, here's a juicy one that I didn't even go into. That's a scary one, actually. We're just going to move that from that one entirely. So the question that really comes up, I think, is where did everybody go? Where did all those folks go? First of all, there is that dropped baton that I was mentioning, which is the failure of generational replacement. Basically, church folk who grew up churched, didn't raise churched people. But that's not the only story. For a lot of folk, including right here at St. Bart's, you raised your kids here in church. I interviewed some of them. And so I know that kids were raised in churches. Kids had religious education. But something else was going on. There are three other factors that were going on that are hard to fight. One of them is privatization, which especially shows up in technology. Basically, we are living in technology-induced bubbles of isolation, smaller and smaller and smaller. Nothing has privatized American life, walled us off from civic and religious community, and tucked us into self-autonomous pods, quite like cars, TV, internet, and mobile phones. You put all of that together, and that's a big reason why you get this. What also is happening for us, especially with television and the internet, between 1965 and 95, Americans actually gained 6 hours a week of free time. So all of the technological advancements gave us 6 hours. And what do you think we did with those? We watched TV. Almost all of that time was taken up watching TV, not being in community. And just a quiz for you, between 2021 and 2023, so 2021 being when we came out of pandemic lockdown, right? From that year to 2023, do you think Americans spent more or less time alone? Those who said more are right. We've actually spent more time alone since pandemic. So the patterns we learned during pandemic stuck. And we now are more likely to go out to dinner alone. We are more likely to be on devices alone. We are more likely to feel flustered in crowds. Anybody had that experience? I know I have. And I'm a raging extrovert. So I figure if it's happening to me, it must be happening for pretty much everybody. So privatization and kind of that atomization of our lives is real. What's also real is secularization. Now, that doesn't mean that Americans are less spiritual, because we still pray a ton, we still express belief in God. All of that is there. And what's also true is that Christianity exerts less domination, less force on American life, which means it's easier for people who didn't really feel that religious to begin with and probably would have said they were nuns in the 50s if McCarthy hadn't been watching. Now, they're able to say when they fill out a study, are you a nun or are you non-religious? They can say, yeah, I don't have a religion, and you can't force me into that anymore. The cultural force toward religious participation has dissipated because of secularization. What's also true is that the religious right has so controlled the narrative about Christianity that a lot of people feel like association with being Christian is association with the religious right, and so they just left Christianity altogether. The data bears it out. It is terrifying, the drop among liberal Christians essentially who vote Democratic, since 1990 to this year, certainly from the 70s to this year, tanked. That, in a way, is secularization. And of course, there's pluralization. The spiritual marketplace is huge. It's so diverse, it's so vast. And especially when you combine the internet with that, you've got options galore. And what can you do? You can create your own bespoke religious experiences, your own personal spiritual path. So many Americans are doing that these days, thanks to pluralization. So all of these forces are coming together in order to grow a post-Christian American landscape. It makes it hard for churches to thrive, but the nuns are doing just fine. They are flourishing in this environment. And so I went out to find out from them what kinds of journeys are they on, and what would they tell us if we were listening. So a few highlights here. For that first question that I asked them, share about your spiritual journey. These are some of the main hinge points, if you will, for people when they decided or maybe even kind of doubled down on not being religious. First off, for a lot of people, they just don't believe. It's nothing personal. In fact, some of the folks that I spoke to who were from St. Bart's, young adults who grew up in this church, love this church. Why aren't they here now? And what they told me is, I actually don't believe what I was taught anymore. I believe something else now. A lot of folk are like Andy, a Latino and white man that I met in San Francisco, who told me, I had a hard time with a ghostly authoritarian figure that's finger wagging at me from a distance. And I had a really hard time with institutions and organizations. I personally had to separate church from spirituality because the church is a man-made thing. For people who really believe in their religion, I think that's great, he told me. It helps to instill good values, gives them community. But I like to think of myself as a very honest person, and I would feel like an imposter being all the way in with church. A lot of people's stories sound like Andy's. A lot of people said that church has hurt people. A lot of folk feel like church just wasn't worth their time. Maybe they were a part of church before, but nothing was happening, or maybe they saw church in their parents' lives and didn't see transformation. They don't know why they would bother. That was what Labria in Atlanta told me. She said, today, with 2 kids and my job, I'd like my children to have the experience of church, but life is so busy. Sunday is our one day of rest. My church growing up, I could be there from 11 to 3:30 p.m. Guess her tradition. And I'm not looking for that experience today. Instead, she finds fulfillment, spiritual fulfillment, when she's in circles of women who run together, do yoga together, and pray together. That's Labria's spiritual path now, because church wasn't really worth her time. A lot of folk don't want to be pinned in by labels, and of course, there are those who were never religious to begin with. So the second question that I asked them was, how do you experience the sacred? If God is out there, if the holy is moving in this world still outside of church, and as Episcopalians, we believe that. We believe in the incarnation. We believe that God's Spirit, God's presence is in here, out there, in us, all around. So how are they experiencing it? When they're connecting with family and friends and lovers, they experience the sacred, and I should say, for a lot of people, I kind of changed language, and sometimes they gave me the language. So if I said, the question basically was, how do you experience the sacred? But sometimes I would change that to, how do you experience the mystery of life? How do you experience ultimate? How do you experience meaning? How do you make meaning? They kind of gave me their language. But so these are all the ways that they access that ultimate luminous part of being alive. They experience it when they're creative and embodied. Jax, who is well known to many in this community, told me that he feels deep peace and connectedness listening to music. And here's a quote. I find songs that have lyrics I really attach to. Those are my teachings. No, really, my bedroom is covered in song lyrics. I have a cork board that's just printed out song lyrics and poems. I've made paintings of song lyrics. That's what one of St. Bart's kids is doing in order to stay close to the sacred. What is there in these songs, in these lyrics that's so powerful for Jax? Often it's just songs reminding you you're worth it, Jax told me. You're gonna get through it. When you find that song, it feels like a wash of relief and profound joy. That's what they're finding out there. Many are finding that profound joy and meaning in nature, or just reflecting in silence. Arpan, who grew up Hindu and now lives in Atlanta, told me about how he combines silent prayer with meditation and quiet journaling in order to experience intimacy with the sacred. Arpan said, I meditate weekly. I've been doing it for 10 or 15 years. I find it very beneficial. I'm in my apartment. I find a quiet place. Make sure there's relatively low light. I'm just focusing on pranayama, or breathing. A lot of times I journal after I meditate. It provides a lot of clarity. That's when I can ask the hard questions like, what is our purpose? Why are we here? What makes us happy? Those are the questions they're sitting with out there. Others are accessing an expanse of spiritual traditions beyond Christianity, and they're also paying attention in a fragmented world. And I want to say it's fascinating that for many millennial and Gen Z folk, and probably for a lot of us too, learning how to pay attention in a world filled with so much technology and distraction, paying attention is by itself a deep spiritual practice. They helped me to acknowledge that. So these are all the ways that they're experiencing the sacred. How are they experiencing community? Stephanie in San Francisco was one of the first people to tell me how hard it is to make community out there in that technology-saturated, privatized, pluralistic culture. She said, something I've been yearning for is community, that sangha or group of people who participate together in the teachings and in service together. I can get pretty excited about reading philosophy and spirituality on my own, she told me. But integrating it and practicing it, to have that, you need people. Give me some people, she said. She's a hospice nurse, and she said that she loves going to her yoga studio. She makes sweet connections with people. But she went on, deep, meaningful community, I would say I don't have. I have 2 really solid friends in the Bay Area I can call on. I have my partner. But I don't feel like there's a place where I could say, this is my home and these are my people. When she said that to me, it broke my heart. Maybe yours too. That folks are out there finding all of these spiritual paths and they are lonely, desperately lonely. She said, the older I get, another year has passed where I'm not part of something. I wonder, do I even still know how to go about being in relationships? Whew, that's heavy. A lot of people are finding a way toward relationship, finding a way through the loneliness and the isolation by belonging with chosen family, belonging around music and the arts. A lot of folk are a part of fitness and yoga groups. And I want to point out here that Grace Cathedral is this glorious cathedral in San Francisco. I spent several days interviewing people hanging out there. They do a yoga group twice a week. Hundreds of people are a part of these groups. I went one Saturday morning and experienced it for myself. You've never seen anything like it. More full than most churches on a Sunday, but full of yoga mats and a yoga teacher named Darren who said this to me about what he understands. He knows that when he's teaching this yoga class at a cathedral in San Francisco, Grace Cathedral, he is actually leading a spiritual community. And here's what he said. Some people can go solo and live in a cave. Good for them. The rest of us need something that holds you while you explore and grow. Most of us need community. We need a safe space where we're seen and felt and known. I strive to create that, this yoga teacher said. Whether or not you touch your toes is irrelevant to me. You feeling safe enough to touch something deep within yourself, that's what matters. There's a church making room for him to teach that in downtown San Francisco. Makes me wonder if there were a church in downtown New York that could create a similar space. Just saying. A lot of people also experience belonging at work and in alternative worship communities. Liam, another of the young folk who grew up in and loved St. Bart's and is now, he comes sometimes here. He also practices regularly in a Buddhist community in New York. He said that community is an integral part of being Buddhist. A lot of people think of Buddhism as being on your own, but no. Community is an integral part of Buddhist practice, Liam told me. When we do these chants and statements every week, we're essentially saying, I go to the Buddha for guidance, I go to the Dharma or the teachings for guidance, and I go to the Sangha or the community for guidance. He said to me that maybe there's an individualistic frame in the U.S. for Buddhism, but for him it's always been about community. And he's finding it there. The last question that I asked, and this was the one where the prophecies rose from the nuns and the duns. I asked them, what do you want churches to know? Which is another way of saying, what's the future of the faith? 4 things they wanted to make sure we know. First of all, will the real Christians please stand up? And this is a quote from an atheist, Ashley. "We don't have a foundational text for atheism," she said, "but Christians have a book they follow that literally says you've got to take care of people and don't step on the weak. So you Christians, you can stand up in church. You can stand up in front of Trump," her quote, "and tell him he's not following the principles he purports to stand for. I, as an atheist, don't have a book like that, but you do. You have words that say you should not let people freeze to death outside or get steamrolled for living in homeless encampments. So speak them." That's them talking to us. They also begged us, please stop making idols of your institutions, your buildings, your rules, your dogma. On this front, I turned to Casper, who lives here in New York and actually does a lot of consulting with religious institutions. Here's what he said. The whole question of buildings is fraught because there's so many lovely places. Amen. So many lovely places. But he continued, honestly, the amount of money and energy that your churches spend on your buildings, if you didn't have to do all of that, it would be so much clearer what the church's job is. He continued, those buildings, maybe they're a representation of your respectability, your power, your influence, even though a lot of churches don't really have that anymore. You have a lot to offer. It's probably not in the way you think. Wow, that's kind of humbling. They also said to us, please go out and meet the God who is waiting outside. Kimberly is an interfaith chaplain in Philadelphia, and she told me this. During COVID, I had a class that encouraged me to meditate out in nature. And mind you, she grew up very religious, very Christian, and still identifies kind of Christian, although she doesn't do church. But she went out meditating in nature, and she said, I had so many rich communion experiences with the divine, almost as rich as times I'd gotten caught up in the Holy Spirit during church. Since then, hiking and meditating by the water have become really important to me in my spiritual practice. She wants to know why she had to leave church to find that out. And finally, they're asking us to form loving, embodied communities that welcome everybody's whole authentic self. And for this, I turn again to Stephanie in San Francisco, who said, when I asked her what do churches need to know, she said, I think they all need to dance more. Wow. She said, God shows up in so many ways outside of the rigidity I saw growing up in an evangelical Central California community. She said there was a lot of fear, a lot of obligation. There was only one way of doing things. But obviously, she continued, religion or God or spirituality cannot be contained. Religion or God or spirituality cannot be contained. So let it loosen up and let kids be kids. Encourage all the people to find God in the places that might surprise them. These are not folks who have given up on us. They're actually ready to be in deep conversation with us. But they also want us to know that something's got to change. And they've even shared some of the ways that we might engage around that. The last quarter of my book is actually engaging with these prophecies, but as a Christian, as a church leader, and I invited other church leaders to help me on that. I think it would be amazing if churches all over, first of all, ask people you know, the folk you know who are not a part of church, ask them those 4 questions. Share with me about spiritual journey. How do you experience the sacred and community? And what do you wish churches knew? And I think it would be amazing if we really sat with their prophecies and asked God, what are you revealing to your church today? I'm grateful to have had the chance to listen for all of that and would love to hear your questions. Oops.
Thank you, Stephanie. What a compelling project, and I'm really looking forward to reading the whole book. We have a few minutes for your questions. Stephanie Terrell is here in the room, and if you raise your hand, she'll come around with a question card and then bring your questions up to me. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. Email also works if you're here in the room. Stephanie, one of the things I love about this project is that you're able to lean back on your past as a journalist.
Yes.
And kind of bring your two vocations together. And I'm wondering this process of diving into the research as well as interviewing folks, what this process has been like for you in terms of thinking about personally what your vocation is going forward.
Oh my goodness. I mean, the truth is that as I've been working on this project, of course, I've also been discerning and asking God, what do you want me to do next? Because I finished my almost 10 years working for the presiding bishop and then had this time that the church gave me. And then my husband has supported the rest of the time. So yeah, I've been wondering about that. And I feel like they're inviting me, honestly, to engage, especially around those prophecies. The prophecies of the nuns and duns that I was describing, those feel very personal. For me, it feels like something I need to reckon with about my own vocation, how I've served so far, and maybe what God is asking me to do next. I also really felt, and I can't say this enough, like interviewing 45 people for about an hour at a time, where they're sharing with you around the deepest parts of their souls. People would ask me at the end of an interview to bless them. And I told them at the beginning, it was like, I'm not here to try to convert you or convince you back to church or anything like that. But it was such a holy time that we shared. And it really got me excited about being back on that ministry frontier. Honestly, they became so dear to me. So what I know is that whatever my next position, whatever my next call, I really want it to be something close to the ground and kind of in parish or helping folk to listen to one another and to God more deeply, and especially in a place where I can connect with that 44% who are out there on that frontier trying to make a way on their own, to let them know you don't have to be alone. God loves you, and so do we.
A member of our in-person audience wonders about the role of technology. They point out that St. Bart's now has a good portion of our community that engages with us principally online.
Yes.
What opportunities does technology provide to reach this group?
Yeah. So especially when I was asking them the question about how and where do you experience the sacred, and also the question about community, I was surprised by their awareness that, and I'm just going to say, they had high awareness that when you are connecting with people online, you are not connecting in the same way. So I would have said, oh, but there are all of these interesting ways people are building community online. And they kind of deconstructed that for me in real time. And we're like, no, we miss in IRL, in real life connections. We miss that. And we know the difference. We can feel connected, we can be sharing. They spoke to me about parasocial relationships. I hadn't even really heard that phrase much until a 22-year-old who's a college student here in New York City was talking to me about, I know I have a lot of parasocial relationships online, but when the stuff really hits, I know that I need to go to my people in person. I'm like, oh, thank you, man. So yes, technology, especially TikTok, is really important, I think, for building that initial relationship, perhaps, capturing attention, building a story, but it's got to be paired with the invitation into those authentic, embodied, dancing communities.
Someone wonders how queerness shows up in your research.
I did not ask the question of all of the folk that I was interviewing. I asked them about race, and about half of them are non-white, and that was by design. You know, when I was looking for people to interview, I made sure that essentially, like Millennial and Gen Z, those two generations are two of the most diverse to walk this planet. and certainly to be in America. And so I knew I had to have a diverse group. As I was interviewing people, many of them shared about how being queer figured into their spiritual journey. Especially when I asked them about why are you not a part of, or I didn't say, when I said, tell me about your spiritual journey. For a lot of people, coming out, unfortunately, and really entering into their queer identity coincided with departing from Christianity. For some, including, for instance, folk who might have grown up in a church like St. Bart's, and this was difficult to take. Maybe they were queer or not, but they knew that an inclusive church exists, but they felt that the religious right, the Christo-nationalist voice, so dominates Christian narrative, so dominates the definition of what it is to be Christian, that even though they know their church is like this, they still feel like they can't associate with Christianity writ large. Do you understand that? So when it comes to them, when it comes down to what religion are you, they feel like I can't be connected with something that's exclusive or hateful or any of that, even though I know a St. Bart's exists. And for many, a lot of that comes down to being allied with or themselves being queer and feeling like I have to stand on the side of justice and love and be a protector and be protected from Christianity itself, which is another heartbreaking thing. But it also said to me this piece about will the real Christians please stand up? That when folk who know there's a different kind of Christianity feel like they can't find it out there because religious right is so loud, we have to get louder. And we have to love louder. We have to witness louder. We have to partner louder. It's not just about having, like marketing, although I think that's important too. But they don't know we're here, and they grew up with us. Something has to shift.
All right, I'll try to fit two more sets of questions in.
All right, I'm trying to go quick too.
Some folks are wondering about interfaith initiatives. There's a fondness for interfaith initiatives present and past here at St. Bart's.
Yeah.
What role can interfaith initiatives play in reaching this population?
I've wondered about that, honestly. I think that there's a role for interfaith initiatives, especially because so many of these nuns and duns don't really get labels. And they don't want to be in a particular lane. They want to be able to explore, to pull from different places. One of the books I read spoke about religious hybrids. And so I think that reality of the hybridity of their lives suggests to me that if you don't have some room for interfaith, you're just pretending. But I think that's also true for a lot of us. My practice is very much informed by the Buddhism that I studied and practiced when I was in college to this day. I think we don't acknowledge that there's already that interfaith stream flowing for a lot of people. If we could lift that up a bit more, that would be great. And studies we have done as the Episcopal Church tell us that Jesus gets big thumbs up in the public. People know his teachings, they like him. 85% of Americans recognize Jesus as an important spiritual leader. The folk that I interviewed they're like, oh yeah, Jesus, he's great. His teachings, his this, his that. Jesus is not the problem. Christians don't practice Jesus. So as much as I'm like, yeah, interfaith, I also believe that we need to be living more and more in the way of Jesus, and that they are watching for us to do that. They know when we're not, and they celebrate it when we are.
Okay, I'll end with two questions that are different, but I think they might have some overlap that will be interesting. One person wonders, do you think that people, meaning the nuns and duns, are underestimating how much churches have changed since they left? This assumes, that portion that had been in church previously. Mm-hmm. Someone else asks, is part of the problem those of us who are in the church and don't want things to change? So I guess the question's around how much have churches changed, and to the extent that we have or not, how much does that factor in?
Yes. So again, these are folk who are ages 18 to 44. So they've actually been around, many of them, especially the ones, I was interviewing people in their 20s who had just been in church like a couple of years ago. So they actually have seen a lot of the change in church. And to that, I even go back to my previous point, that they know that there are churches that have changed and are different, that are inclusive, but they are naming a reality of how we sit within the American public. We're too quiet. And that is something that does need to change. That as much as we feel like, oh, we've changed so much, the reality when a younger person comes in, their culture, and I go into some of this in the book, there's something called the millennial zeitgeist, which is not just about millennials as a generation, but it's the zeitgeist or the mood of the age that has formed since 2000, so millennial in that way. That culture that has formed looks so different from your average Sunday, including right here at St. Bart's. So we think we've changed, but in terms of changing enough to speak to that millennial zeitgeist, there is a cultural mismatch. And some scholars actually speak about church being obsolete because of that. I don't believe we're obsolete. I don't believe that this is game over, but I do believe that we need to find ways of engaging the culture as it is, to go into your sermon, which was awesome. We need to engage the culture as it is instead of pretending that we know what's going on out there and that they just don't know us. Actually, a lot of them know us, and they're asking for more, for us to move further out of our comfort zones and more into the Spirit.
All right, we're officially out of time.
There.
I am going to fit in one more question really quickly. What is the future of faith as you see it, and/or what do you hope the future of faith will be?
I hope that it will be a future where, and this is, again, this is the chapter that took me the longest to write and that feels honestly the most important. I hope that in the future, I believe actually this has to happen, for there to be a future for Christianity in America, Christians who are following the way of Jesus, who is loving, liberating, and life-giving, must stand up. We cannot be the quiet Christians anymore. We cannot be assuming, well, as long as we do good works, they'll know that that was us. They don't associate good works with Christian. Do you feel me? So you can do all the good works you want. They don't think it's Christian. So that means we have to redefine Christian. We have to take the narrative back. We have to reclaim Christianity. So that's the future. The future is not making idols of our institutions, buildings, rules, and dogma. I love this building so much, and we as a church and churches in general will have to find a way to put as much energy and love into the way we engage our broader culture, as much energy and resource into that as we do into our buildings. And that is a massive project and a massive rethinking, but it's what's necessary for a future church. If it's just about our buildings and institutions, we will die. You saw those first slides. If we don't change the way we understand and prioritize, the future won't be there. We've got to meet God outside, which means getting out and connecting with people who are beyond church. It also means just finding ways of celebrating the role of nature in spiritual life, which seems simple, but we don't do a lot of it. But there are ways that we could be decorating and telling stories and inviting people to name how they meet the Spirit in the natural world, because I'm telling you, it's happening. It is so deep and rich. And finally, these embodied communities, we've got to just find ways to loosen up and to make room so that people who feel that need to move feel like they have a home in our midst. Some of that is honestly around, I think, loosening up on our hold on kind of the Anglo domination of Episcopal life. In other words, the domination of whiteness, and how whiteness tends to demand a certain way of moving in the world. And these nuns and duns are saying, and I think the future of America tells us that we've got to be able to embody something that folk of color and queer folk and younger folk know in our bones. It needs to be a part of the bones of the whole church. There.
All right, we definitely have to stop there. Please join me in thanking Canon Stephanie Spellers.
Thank you all! Yay! That was fun.
Stick around and join us for worship, and be back next week when our bishop is here to speak with us. See you then.